The X-plane or X-planes are a series of experimental aircraft that have been developing in the United States industry since 1946. They are and were used to test new technologies and are usually kept strictly secret during their development. This series provided very important research results, starting with the Bell X-1, which became very well known for being the first plane to break the sound barrier, and all achieved in 1947. Most X-planes were never expected to go into large-scale production, although there are exceptions like the Lockheed Martin X-35, which later became the F-35 we know today. In this video, we are going to try to review the X-plane series, also finding unmanned vehicles and missiles. Welcome to a new video. This is Aviation World. As we had already, the series starts with the Bell X-1, originally named XS-1, and it was the first plane to exceed the speed of sound in horizontal flight. This aircraft had its first flight on January 19th of 46, but it was only on flight number 50 where it exceeded the speed of sound for the first time. A milestone achieved on October 14th of 1947, piloted by Charles Yeager. This aircraft, powered by a rocket engine, was launched from the belly of a modified B-29. Currently, this machine is on display at the National Air and Space Museum in Washington. The X-2, also from Bell Company, nicknamed Starbuster, was the first experimental aircraft built to investigate flight characteristics at Mach 2 and Mach 3 speeds. The technical difficulties engineers face when approaching these speeds are the thermal barrier, for example, which causes severe overheating effects due to aerodynamic friction. The first launch of this aircraft was from a modified B-50 bomber in 1952. And unfortunately, it would be lost on a test flight in 53. A second prototype flew at the end of 55, reaching a speed of Mach 2.87 or about 3,050 kilometers per hour. The X-3 Stiletto was a high-speed jet aircraft manufactured by Douglas. Its main mission was to investigate the design characteristics of an aircraft suitable for maintaining supersonic speeds, and for the first time included the use of titanium in the main components of the structure. The Northrop X-4 of Anthem was a small bioreactor devoid of tail horizontal stabilizers and was used to study combined aileron and depth rudder control surfaces. Some engineers proposed that these aerodynamics would eliminate stability problems at supersonic speeds, which arose from the interaction of shock waves with the wings and horizontal stabilizers. However, this did not manage to work, but in this type of aircraft you can see the spirit of the X-planes trying to test completely new concepts for the time. Another case of this was the Bell X-5, the first aircraft capable of changing the angle of its wings in flight. It is said to have been inspired by the design of the Messerschmitt P-1101, a German World War II aircraft equipped with the first jet engines. Its key feature was the ability to adjust its wing angles while on the ground before flight, making it the originator of variable geometry in aircraft. The engineers at Bell Company created a system of electric motors to be able to move these wings in full flight with 3 position angles, 20, 30 and 60 degrees. The X6 from the Convair factory was a proposal for an experimental aircraft to study whether planes could be powered by nuclear energy. The idea was to modify two B-36Es, one to study radiation protection for a nuclear reactor, while the other would be the prototype of the X6, which carried a 3-megawatt air-cooled nuclear reactor, which in theory was going to power the engines, but the project only got to have a functional reactor in the aircraft, but it did not power the plane, and it was only used to investigate the effects of radiation on the aircraft personnel. The Lockheed X-7 was an unmanned testbed for ramjets and missile guidance technology. For testing, it was carried by the B-29 and B-50 planes. The auxiliary rocket booster was initiated after launch and propelled the aircraft up to 1,600 kilometers per hour, then igniting the ramjet, operating with this. It reached maximum speeds of up to 3,250 kilometers per hour. From this, X-7 to the X-12 were all missiles, where we will also name the X-8 from the Aerojet General Company, which was an unguided sounding rocket designed to launch a payload of up to about 68 kilos. The X-9 was from the Bell Company and was used as a test bed for nuclear bombs that later led to supersonic air-to-surface missile projects. The X-10 belonged to the North American factory and, like the Bell aircraft, was an advanced missile technology demonstrator. It later evolved into advanced SM-64 cruise missiles and was powered by two turbojets and could even take off like a conventional airplane. The Convair X-11 was the first test bed for what would later become the Atlas program, a very important family of American rockets used to launch satellites and space probes, also used as an intercontinental ballistic missile. The Convair X-12 was also the second and more advanced testbed for this Atlas project, but this design had 3 engines compared to the X-11 that only used 1 engine. The Ryan X-13 Vertijet was an experimental vertical takeoff and landing or vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. The main objective of this project was to demonstrate the capabilities of performing a vertical takeoff, gliding, transitioning from vertical to horizontal, and landing vertically again. An unprecedented feat. It had a single Rolls-Royce turbojet and a hook on the nose that was used to grab a cable on the landing platform. Pitch and yaw controls were provided by the thrust of the main engine, and roll control was achieved using small thrusters at the ends of each wing. The Bell X-14 was also an experimental model for vertical takeoff and landing, but the goal of this project was not only to take off in this way, but also to be able to perform conventional flights and landings. This aircraft was designed using parts from existing planes. The wings, ailerons, and main gear were from a Beechcraft Bonanza, and the tail section was from a T-34 Mentor. The North American X-15 was a rocket plane used by the United States Air Force, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and the US Navy. It was also one of the most important developments of the X series, as it not only managed to break several speed and altitude records, but it reached what we can call the boundary with outer space or Kármán line, obtaining very important information that would be used in the designs of airplanes and spacecraft later on. This device made it possible to exceed 62 miles in altitude and the incredible speed of 7.274 kilometers per hour on June 28, 1964. The X-16 from Bell Company was a high-altitude reconnaissance jet, but it never got to fly. The project was cancelled in favor of the Martin RB-57 Canberra. The X-17 was a test vehicle used during the 50s to study the problem of high-speed atmospheric re-entry effects. It was a 3-stage rocket powered by solid fuel. The Hiller-18 was an experimental cargo transport aircraft designed to be the first test bed for twin-wing or pistol technology, vertical or short takeoff landing. Only one prototype was built that first flew in 1959. The program was cancelled in '64 and unfortunately ended up scrapped as junk, but it contributed to other piston technology programs. The X-19 was another vertical takeoff and landing technology program, but with tilting rotors. It had a single turboshaft engine, which powered 2 tilt propellers, while the exhaust gases from the engine were used in the tail rotor pod to provide additional control for flight. Its first prototype was destroyed in an accident and the program was subsequently cancelled. A second prototype was never completed because of this. Boeing's X-20 was a program to develop a spacecraft that could carry out a series of military missions, including reconnaissance, bombing, special rescue, satellite maintenance, and sabotage of enemy satellites. But this project was cancelled just after the construction of the first prototype had begun. The Northrop X-21 was an experimental aircraft designed to test wings with laminar flow control. It was based on the fuselage of the Douglas B-66D. Useful tests were carried out with this, but the extensive maintenance of the laminar flow system caused the end of the program. The Bell X-22 was another development of vertical or short takeoff and landing technology, but this one had 4 guided flow tilting propellers. The developments were later used for aircraft like the B-22 Osprey. The Martin Marietta X-23 Prime was a continuation of the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty project, whose purpose was to test necessary technologies to maneuver lifting bodies in atmospheric re-entry. The application of such technology included warheads for intercontinental ballistic missiles, as well as return capsules of photographic material from reconnaissance satellites and manned vehicles. The X-24 was also from the Martin Marietta factory, an experimental aircraft developed by the United States Air Force and National Aeronautics and Space Administration in the pilot program. It was designed and built to verify the concepts of lifting body as well as atmospheric re-entry and engineless landing, developments later used in National Aeronautics and Space Administration Space Transportation System shuttle. The Benson X-25 was a small experimental autogyro built for the United States Air Force during the Vietnam War, which was thought of as a possible rescue machine, but in the end, no one was interested in this concept. The Schweizer X-26 was a program for research in motorized gliders. The developments of these were used for the United States Navy Pilot School. The Lockheed X-27, also known as CL-1200 Lancer, was a company-funded proposal for the improvement of the F-104 Starfighter, but it was cancelled at the mock-up stage. The X-28 was also known as Ice Skimmer, Sea Skimmer, or even Osprey GP2 and was an amphibious aircraft. It is designed to study conditions of ultralight amphibious aircraft. The Grumman X-29 was another important experimental fighter aircraft project which served as a basis for investigating a set of new technologies which were applied in future combat aircraft like those of the 5th generation. This aircraft's most notable features were the inverted arrow wing and canard flight surfaces. 2 prototypes were built, and their first flight took place in 1984. The Rockwell X-30 was an aerospace plane project that was cancelled in the early 90s before a prototype was completed, but it contributed a lot to the development of advanced materials and aerospace designs. The initial goal was to generate a transatlantic transport aircraft capable of making 2-hour flights from Washington to Tokyo. The Rockwell Messerschmitt Bölkow-Blohm X-31 was an experimental aircraft created as a German-American collaboration program to test vector thrust technologies in scarce aircraft. Its first flight was in 1990 with 2 prototypes built. Unfortunately, one of them crashed in 1995. The Boeing X-32 was a multi-purpose combat aircraft project proposed by this company for the Joint Strike Fighter program. It ultimately lost against the Lockheed Martin X-35 proposal. 2 prototypes of this were built, the first to be used in conventional landings and takeoffs. The second landed and took off vertically. The X-33 was a suborbital space plane proposal from Lockheed Martin, built in an unmanned subscale. This aircraft would test in flight the technologies that National Aeronautics and Space Administration believed were needed for reusable launch vehicles. The project was cancelled in 2001. The Orbital Sciences X-34 was also an unmanned experimental vehicle from National Aeronautics and Space Administration designed to test the technologies of reusable but low-cost vehicles. Like the previous one, it was cancelled in 2001 due to high costs before it could make a single test flight. The Lockheed Martin X-35, as we had previously said, was proposed for the Joint Strike Fighter, official winner of the contest in October 2001 and entering mass production in 2006. One of the few X-planes that achieved this. The X-36 was from the McDonnell Douglas factory and had proposed a research aircraft for tailless fighter maneuverability. It was a scale prototype of a possible jet aircraft, but without the traditional tail surfaces used in most aircraft. The Boeing X-37, also called Orbital Taste Vehicle or Orbital Taste Vehicle, is an unmanned spaceplane designed to test future spaceflight technologies during its stay in orbit and re-entry into the atmosphere. This project was initiated in 1999 by National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and an unmanned scale aircraft was launched in April of 2010. The X-38 CRB was another National Aeronautics and Space Administration project in which lifting bodies were studied. The X-39, 41 and 42 are classified projects about which little to nothing is known, so I can't tell you about them. But yes, the X-40 subsonic maneuvering bomber from the Boeing factory, a reusable launch vehicle project, and successfully demonstrated the gliding capabilities and the validity of this device's guidance system. The X-43 from National Aeronautics and Space Administration is an unmanned experimental aircraft powered by scrumjet engines designed to fly at speeds greater than Mach 10. It's part of National Aeronautics and Space Administration's HyperX or HyperX program. The initial data obtained from this experimental vehicle demonstrated that its revolutionary engine successfully operated at nearly Mach 9.8 while flying at over 33,000 meters. The Lockheed Martin X-44 Manta, or tailless multi-axis airplane, is a conceptual design. Devised by Lockheed Martin and National Aeronautics and Space Administration to test the viability of yaw, pitch and roll controls without the need to use a tail, studies that had begun with the X-36. The Boeing X-45 is an unmanned combat air vehicle developed as a concept demonstrator for a completely autonomous next-generation craft and is part of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency's High-Altitude Unmanned Combat Air System project. Also from this company is the X-46, a development of the previous one and which competed for contracts to be manufactured for the Navy and the Air Force of the United States. Also for the Joint Unmanned Combat Air System program or Joint Unmanned Combat Air System. Another program that competed for this was the X-47 from Northrop Grumman, which was the first unmanned aircraft to land on aircraft carriers. The Pegasus, which is what this company called it, is still in development. The Boeing X-48 was an unmanned aerial vehicle or unmanned aerial vehicle experimental research into the characteristics of blended wing-body aircraft or flying wing aircraft. It seems that Boeing and National Aeronautics and Space Administration plan to develop one of these of a larger size. The Piasecki X-49, nicknamed Speedhawk, was a helicopter where vector thrust impulse was studied. It was based on a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter, but included a third engine for faster flights. The X-50 Dragonfly was a rotary wing demonstrator. It was an unmanned aircraft developed by Boeing and Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency to demonstrate the principle that a helicopter rotor could be stopped in flight and act as a fixed wing, enabling the transition between fixed wing and rotary wing flight. The X-51, also from the company Boeing and known as Web Rider, is an unmanned aircraft with scramjet-type engines of hypersonic speed. Developed by a consortium made up of the United States Air Force, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, National Aeronautics and Space Administration, Boeing, and Pratt & Whitney. It is created to study hypersonic flights at more than Mach 7. The X-52 does not exist. It was never used to avoid confusion with the prototype of the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress. The X-53 was a joint program with the Air Force Research Laboratory where the technology was flight tested in a modified F-18 Hornet. The idea was to study new wing structures to take advantage of and control the wing air elastic effect at high speeds and aerodynamic pressures. The X-54 was a research and technology demonstration aircraft for future supersonic transport for National Aeronautics and Space Administration. It was used primarily to study the sonic boom and mitigate the noise pollution of future aircraft. The Lockheed Martin X-55 is an experimental transport aircraft intended to demonstrate new capabilities using advanced composite materials. The Lockheed Martin X-56, a modular unmanned American aerial vehicle designed to explore high-endurance and high-altitude flight technologies for use in future unmanned reconnaissance aircraft. Only these last projects currently being worked on would remain, such as the X-57, which is an experimental aircraft developed by National Aeronautics and Space Administration based on a fuselage of an Italian-made Tecnam P2006, but with multiple electric motors intended to demonstrate technologies to reduce fuel use, emissions, and noise. The XQ-58 Valkyr is an experimental unmanned combat aerial vehicle from the Kratos factory to demonstrate the concept of low-cost attack aircraft. The X-59 is a supersonic flight demonstrator developed by Lockheed Martin and National Aeronautics and Space Administration, with the first test flights scheduled in 2022. And the idea is to create a new supersonic passenger transport vehicle, but overcoming the problems of the sonic boom. And finally, the X-60 from Generation Orbit, which is developing technology for launching small payloads into space, but at a very low cost. Also as an extra, we can mention the X-Zone and Experimental Propulsion Spaceplane, designed by Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency to send small satellites into orbit for the United States military. The idea is to learn how to make a device designed to be reusable with a frequency as high as once a day. The test programs are scheduled to start no earlier than 2020. I hope you enjoyed this long video. If so, like, share and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Until a new installment, this is Aviation World.